Your Honor, the state requests that you continue to hold the defendant, Jennifer Gledhill, without bail. In this case, there is substantial evidence. There's substantial evidence that supports that Matthew Johnson is not missing. Matthew Johnson was murdered by the defendant.
It begins with confession, not in a courtroom, not in front of police, but whispered in the shadows to a lover, a secret so dark, so chilling, that once spoken, it could never be taken back. The woman was Jennifer Gledhill, a 41-year-old mother of three from Utah. The man she was speaking about was her husband, Matthew Johnson, a 51-year-old Utah National Guardsman who had served his country with pride and who, until recently, had still believed that maybe life could give him a fresh start. But Matthew never got that chance. According to prosecutors, on the night of September 22nd, 2024, while her husband slept peacefully in their bed, Jennifer lifted his own 9mm handgun and fired a single shot into his head. A devoted father, a soldier, and a friend to so many was gone in an instant. But that wasn't the end. What Jennifer allegedly did after the gunshot is something out of a nightmare. Authorities say she packed Matthew's body into a rooftop cargo box, the kind families used to carry luggage on vacations. She lifted it into the family's minivan, drove away under cover night, and buried him in a shallow grave somewhere north of their home in Cottonwood Heights, Utah. A husband was dead, a father was missing, and for nearly 2 weeks, no one knew the truth, except for Jennifer and the man she told. 2 nights later, just before midnight, Jennifer appeared at the home of her lover, the man she had been secretly seeing behind Matthew's back. She looked rattled, nervous, weighed down by something unspeakable. And then she told him everything. How Matthew had confronted her about the affair, how she waited until he was asleep, how she pulled the trigger, and how she tried to erase the evidence. At first, the man didn't know what to think. Was she serious? Was she exaggerating? But the horror of her words haunted him. Later, during a phone call, he decided to record their conversation. What Jennifer said in that call would later shake everyone who heard it. "Wow. If you think I could even hurt a fly," she said. And then, almost casually, she added, like he's not a person. He wasn't a person anymore. He wasn't Matt. Those words would become the heart of the prosecution's case, cold, detached, and chillingly dehumanizing. For Matthew Johnson's friends, it was almost impossible to imagine. They remembered a man who was loyal, tough, and deeply devoted to his children. They remembered a soldier who had faced combat, who had carried the weight of service, who still laughed and still cared deeply about the people around him. But inside his own home, with the woman who promised to love him, he was betrayed. By October 2nd, 2024, Jennifer's secret was no longer safe. Her lover walked into a police station and handed over everything. Screenshots of texts, recordings of phone calls, every piece of evidence he had. That same day, Jennifer was arrested. When police entered the couple's home, what they found painted a disturbing picture. Beneath the carpet under their bed, investigators discovered blood belonging to Matthew Johnson. On one wall, bleach stains told a story of attempted cleanup. And soon, suspicion spread even further, to Jennifer's own parents. Authorities alleged that Thomas and Rosalie Gledhill had helped their daughter scrub the scene, and they, too, were arrested for obstruction of justice. But there was still one thing missing: Matthew himself. Even now, his body has not been recovered. For his family, his friends, and his fellow soldiers, that absence has been unbearable. More than 100 members of the Utah National Guard joined search parties in the rugged terrain, where GPS data placed Jennifer in the days after shooting. They scoured fields, rivers, and rocky landscapes, hoping to bring their friend home. As one of them put it, "We don't leave a friend behind." It's a line that cuts especially deep, because Matthew wasn't just a friend, he was a brother in arms, a man who had fought side by side with them in service. A man who had trusted his comrades, who had trusted his family, and who, in the end, may have been betrayed by the one person he trusted most. Jennifer now sits in the Salt Lake County Jail, charged with 9 felonies. including first-degree murder. She has pleaded not guilty. Her trial is set for December 2025, and until then, she will remain behind bars, held without bail. Prosecutors are confident. In court, Deputy District Attorney Emily Paulos put it bluntly, Matthew Johnson is not missing. Matthew Johnson was murdered by the defendant, but Jennifer's defense team insists she is innocent. They argue that the state is relying too heavily on the word of one man, her lover, and that without a body, the evidence is far from certain. And so, the case has become not only a fight for justice, but a psychological battlefield. A story of love turned toxic, of marriage torn apart by betrayal, and of a man who saw the danger but couldn't escape it in time. For friends of the couple, the signs were there. Jennifer had tried, on multiple occasions, to obtain protective orders against Matthew, claiming she feared him, but judges repeatedly denied her requests, with one ruling even noting that she was the instigator in many of their conflicts. Meanwhile, Matthew confided to those closest to him that Jennifer's erratic behavior had grown so unsettling that he often avoided sleeping at home. In the last weeks of his life, he stayed many nights at a National Guard facility, worried about what might happen if he stayed under the same roof. To those who knew him, it was heartbreaking. He wanted out. He wanted a divorce. He was ready to move on. His friend, retired Guardsman Kevin Thompson, recalled one of their last conversations. He had really come to the conclusion that a divorce needs to happen and it is time to move on. But he never got the chance. And that is where the darkness of the story truly lies. Because this wasn't just a crime of passion, prosecutors argue. This was premeditation, a decision made in the silence of night, carried out with cold precision, and later confessed with chilling detachment. 3 children are left without their father. And if the state is right, they've lost their mother, too. The trial ahead will dig into every detail. The fights, the affair, the confession, the cleanup, and the search for Matthew's body. And in the end, it will try to answer the question that still lingers over everyone who hears this story. What could possibly drive a wife and mother to take the life of the man who once meant everything to her? Before the gunshot, before the late-night confession, before the arrests, there was a marriage collapsing under its own weight. To outsiders, Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill looked like a typical suburban couple. They had 3 children, all under the age of 13. They had a home in Cottonwood Heights, Utah. They had a life that, on the surface, looked ordinary. But beneath that surface, cracks had been spreading for years. Matthew was a soldier, a man who lived by loyalty and discipline. He had served in Marines before joining the Utah National Guard's 19 Special Forces Group. His friends described him as dependable, steady, the kind of man who always had your back. He wasn't perfect, but he was solid. Jennifer was different. Friends later said she seemed like a homebody, quiet, polite. But inside the marriage, she was often volatile. The relationship had turned rocky, and arguments became a constant part of their lives. It wasn't just small disagreements. It was yelling accusations, emotional explosions. The fights grew so bitter that the couple moved toward divorce. But even that process was messy, full of threats, protective orders, and distrust. Jennifer went to court several times in an attempt to get restraining orders against Matthew. She claimed she was afraid of him, that he was a threat. But judges weren't convinced. In fact, in at least one instance, the court found that Jennifer herself was the instigator, that she provoked many of the conflicts she later tried to use as grounds for protection. Every request was denied. For Matthew, the situation was exhausting. Friends say the tension was taking a visible toll on him. He looked worn down. He worried constantly. And in the final weeks of his life, he started avoiding home altogether. At times, he slept at a National Guard facility instead of under the same roof as Jennifer. He told his friends he was concerned for his safety, and he confided that he wasn't sure how much longer he could live this way. One of his closest friends, retired Guardsman Kevin Thompson, remembered their last conversations. Matthew was firm. He said it was time. He was ready for divorce. He wanted to move on. It wasn't an easy choice, but for him, it felt necessary. But here's the tragic part. He never got the chance to make that move. September 22nd, 2024 was supposed to be another step toward that future. Instead, prosecutors say it became the night Jennifer ended everything. To understand just how much pressure had built inside this marriage, it helps to see how Jennifer was acting in the weeks leading up to Matthew's death. Her affair was no longer a small secret. Matthew had confronted her. He knew, and the tension between them only escalated. Prosecutors believe this confrontation may have been the spark that set the entire tragedy in motion. Jennifer's behavior became increasingly erratic. One friend of Matthew's later said her actions were so unnerving that Matthew didn't feel safe at home anymore. And it wasn't paranoia. In hindsight, those fears turned out to be chillingly justified. When prosecutors laid out the case in court, they painted a picture of a woman cornered by a failing marriage and an exposed affair. Instead of choosing divorce, instead of walking away, they say Jennifer made a darker choice, to take Matthew's life and to erase him completely. And after the crime, the story didn't stop. In fact, it became even more disturbing. Investigators say Jennifer tried to cover up what she had done. They claim she enlisted the help of her parents, Thomas and Rosalie, both in their late 60s. Evidence suggested that someone had cleaned parts of the house, scrubbing blood from the carpet, wiping down a wall with bleach. Prosecutors accused her parents of helping her hide the crime, and soon they, too, were facing charges of obstruction of justice. For Matthew's friends, this wasn't just another case. It was personal. They had served with him, trained with him, trusted him, and the thought that he'd been killed in such a brutal, intimate way, in his own bed by the woman he shared his life with, was unbearable. So when the search for his body began, his fellow soldiers showed up in force. More than 100 guardsmen combed to the rugged Utah landscape, following GPS data that prosecutors say placed Jennifer's phone in certain areas after the murder. These were combat veterans, men who had seen war and loss, now walking fields and canyons for a fallen brother. One of them said it best, "We don't want to leave a friend behind." But despite their efforts, Matthew's body has never been found. That absence lingers over the case like a shadow. It's one thing to hear about blood on the carpet, about bleach on the walls, about chilling confessions. But without a body, the crime feels both horrifyingly real and frustratingly incomplete. For Matthew's 3 children, the absence is worse than anything else. They don't just grieve their father's death. They don't even have a grave to visit. Their childhood has been shattered in 2 directions. Their father gone, their mother in jail. At such young ages, they are left with trauma no child should ever endure. Meanwhile, Jennifer's recorded words echo through every courtroom hearing. He's not a person. He wasn't Matt. To prosecutors, those words are everything. They reveal not just what she did, but how she saw her husband in that final moment. No longer as a man, no longer as a father, but as something disposable. Her defense team, of course, paint a different picture. They argue that the prosecution is relying heavily on one witness, Jennifer's lover, a man, they suggest, who has his own motives, his own credibility issues. Without a body, without direct forensic evidence tying Jennifer to the murder weapon, can the state really prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she killed her husband? It's a question that will haunt the trial when it begins. But for Matthew's family and friends, the answer feels painfully clear. The contrast between Jennifer and Matthew couldn't be sharper. He was a man who served, who tried to protect his children, who finally decided to break free from a toxic marriage. She was a woman who, prosecutors say, chose violence over freedom, and who confessed her darkest act not in remorse, but almost casually to the man she was seeing on the side. By the time police moved in, Jennifer was facing 9 felony charges, first-degree murder, obstruction, and with her parents also under suspicion, the entire family was dragged into the legal storm. In the end, the story of Matthew Johnson's last days isn't just about one night, one gunshot, one shallow grave. It's about years of tension, years of warning signs, and a man who saw the danger but didn't escape it in time. He was supposed to be her escape, the man she turned to when her marriage to Matthew was falling apart, a secret relationship that at first seemed like passion, like freedom. But as prosecutors later revealed, this affair became the key to unlocking the truth behind Matthew Johnson's disappearance. The man has not been publicly named in all court filings, but investigators described him as Jennifer's boyfriend, someone she met during the breakdown of her marriage. In his own way, he became both a witness and the silent recorder of her darkest secret. According to court documents, Jennifer confided in him about Matthew's death. She didn't whisper it in guilt. She didn't say it in fear. She admitted it like a cold fact. One night, while sitting together, she allegedly turned to him and said, "He's not a person. He wasn't mad." Those words weren't just strange. They were haunting. It was as if she had stripped Matthew of his humanity, reduced him to an obstacle she had removed. The boyfriend later told investigators that Jennifer explained how she killed Matthew. The gunshot, the body, the cover-up. It was a confession delivered not to police, not to a therapist, but to the man she was seeing on the side. At first, he didn't know what to do. He was shaken, but he was also close to Jennifer. Maybe it wasn't true, he thought. Maybe she was exaggerating. But the more time passed, the more Jennifer repeated herself, the more his doubts turned into dread. Finally, he made a choice. He started recording her. In one recording, Jennifer allegedly described Matthew in dehumanizing terms. In another, she talked about the body. And in yet another, she suggested her parents were aware of what had happened, maybe even involved. For prosecutors, these recordings were gold. They turned whispers into evidence, hearsay into hard proof. But there was one problem. Even with these confessions, investigators still didn't have a body. And so began one of the largest search efforts Utah had seen in recent years. Using cell phone data, GPS tracking, and Jennifer's known movements, police mapped out possible dump sites. They zeroed in on areas near Utah Lake, a sprawling, rugged landscape. And when Matthew's fellow guardsmen heard about the search, they volunteered to help. Picture it. More than 100 men, trained soldiers, walking shoulder to shoulder through fields, canyons, and brush. Some had served overseas, searching for lost brothers on foreign soil. Now they were back home, searching for one of their own in the mountains and valleys of Utah. It was heartbreaking and powerful at the same time. They weren't just combing the ground for evidence. They were honoring Matthew, refusing to leave him behind. But despite weeks of searching, Matthew's body was never found. That absence became Jennifer's only shield. Without a body, the defense could argue, was there really a murder? Could the state prove it? Still, prosecutors pressed on, because what they did have was chilling. Blood evidence inside the Johnson home. Not just drops, but traces on the carpet, on a wall, spots that someone had tried to clean with bleach. Jennifer's own words, captured on tape by her boyfriend, words no innocent spouse would ever utter. A timeline that showed Matthew vanished the very same night Jennifer was last with him. Her parent involvement, with investigators alleging that Thomas and Rosalie Gledhill helped clean up after killing. By late September, the pressure on Jennifer was closing in. Detectives had the recordings. They had the forensics. They had the mounting suspicions. And soon, they had enough for an arrest. When police moved in, Jennifer wasn't just facing one charge. She was hit with 9 felonies, the most serious being aggravated murder, which carries a possibility of life in prison without parole. Her parents were also charged, accused of obstruction of justice for their alleged role in scrubbing the house. At nearly 70 years old, they suddenly found themselves dragged into a nightmare no parent could imagine. The courtroom scenes that followed were raw. Prosecutors laid out their theory with precision. Jennifer killed Matthew to free herself from the marriage, to protect her secret affair, and then try to erase every trace of him. But the defense pushed back hard. They argued that the state's case leaned almost entirely on Jennifer's lover, A man who had every reason to protect himself and shift blame onto her. They said the recordings were unreliable, taken out of context. They pointed out that without a body, there was no conclusive forensic link between Jennifer and Matthew's death. Still, the public couldn't shake the unease, because while lawyers argued legal technicalities, 3 children were left without parents. Their father was presumed dead. Their mother was behind bars. Their grandparents were under criminal indictment. What haunted people most wasn't just a crime. It was the coldness of Jennifer's words. He's not a person. He wasn't mad. Psychologists who studied the case suggested that this kind of language revealed a detachment, a way of justifying violence by dehumanizing the victim. It wasn't just that Jennifer may have killed her husband. It was that she stripped him of his very identity in the process. For Matthew's friends, it was unbearable. Kevin Thompson, the retired guardsman who had spoken to Matthew just weeks before his death, described the pain of knowing his friend's worst fears had come true. He told me he wasn't safe, Thompson recalled, and now he's gone. Even in death or in absence, Matthew's loyalty shone through. He had stayed close to his children, tried to protect them from the chaos of the divorce. In the end, though, the chaos consumed him. By the time Jennifer stood in court, dressed in jailhouse orange, the community was divided. Some saw her as a cold-blooded killer, a woman who murdered her husband to pursue an affair. Others wondered if the state really had enough evidence to convict without a body. But one fact was undeniable. Matthew Johnson had vanished, and everything pointed back to the woman who had once vowed to love him. The trial was set. The charges were heavy. And as the case moved forward, the nation watched, not just to see whether Jennifer would be convicted, but to see if Matthew's body would ever be found. Because without him, the story remains incomplete. The courtroom was heavy with silence. Each time Jennifer Gledhill appeared before the judge, the room seemed to freeze. Dressed in her jail uniform, she carried none of the warmth of a mother, none of the grief of a widow. Her face was blank, her posture stiff. To observers, she looked almost attached, as if the storm surrounding her didn't quite reach her skin. But the storm was real. The prosecution laid out its theory with methodical precision. Jennifer had murdered Matthew Johnson, her husband of more than a decade, in cold blood. She had carried out the act while he slept, vulnerable, unaware, defenseless. Then, with calculated steps, she had removed his body, hidden it, and tried to erase every sign he had ever been there. They pointed to the recordings made by her lover. In one, her words were chilling. He's not a person. He wasn't mad. Prosecutors argued this wasn't a language of grief. It was a language of someone who had already dehumanized her victim, who had rationalized killing him by convincing herself he no longer existed as a husband, as a father, as a man. Then came the blood evidence. On the carpet beneath the couple's bed, investigators had found traces that matched Matthew's DNA. On the wall, bleach marks suggested an attempt to wipe away stains. Together, these details painted a grim picture. Matthew hadn't walked out of that house. Something terrible had happened inside those walls. And there was the timeline. On September 20th, Matthew had confronted Jennifer about her affair. On September 21st, he spoke with friends about finally moving forward with divorce. By September 22nd, he was gone. No more calls. No more messages. His life simply ended in silence. The prosecution's case was simple. Jennifer didn't want a divorce. She wanted freedom, but freedom on her own terms. With Matthew alive, she faced custody battles, financial losses, the exposure of her affair. With Matthew dead, she had control, but the defense fired back. They reminded the jury again and again, there was no body, no corpse, no autopsy, no bullet lodged in bone. Without a body, could anyone be certain Matthew was dead? Could they prove Jennifer had pulled the trigger? They questioned the credibility of Jennifer's lover. Was he really reliable? Or was he protecting himself, twisting words, and feeding prosecutors a story that shifted all the blame onto Jennifer? After all, he had reasons to cover his own involvement, and they stressed the chaos of the Johnson marriage, the fights, the protective order attempts, the mutual accusations. Could it be that Matthew had simply left? Could it be that his disappearance wasn't murder but escape? The defense's voice was sharp, but for many in the courtroom, the weight of Jennifer's own words drowned it out. He wasn't mad anymore. Words spoken casually, almost coldly, as if his humanity had been erased. Outside the courtroom, the community wrestled with grief. Matthew's fellow guardsmen, who had once searched hills and fields for his remains, now stood in quiet frustration. They had combed the Utah wilderness, hoping to bring their brother home, only to return empty-handed. The absence gnawed at them. Soldiers are trained never to leave a man behind. But here, despite all their effort, Matthew was still missing. Friends remembered his laughter, his loyalty. They remembered his last words when he told them divorce was the only way forward. None of them could have imagined those would be the final conversations of his life. And then there were the children. 3 young kids, all under 13, suddenly caught in a nightmare. Their father gone, their mother accused of killing him. The grandparents, people they trusted, now under suspicion of helping clean up the crime. Imagine being that young, looking around your family and realizing almost every adult in your world was gone, either buried, accused, or locked away. Their lives have been shattered in a way most of us can't even begin to comprehend. Psychologists who followed the case said the children's trauma would be lifelong. Even if the court sorted out custody, even if extended family stepped in, the shadow of what happened between Jennifer and Matthew would never leave them. They would grow up with questions that had no satisfying answers. Back in court, prosecutors framed Jennifer as manipulative, a woman who had used the legal system to her advantage, filing for protective orders, but losing them when the court found she was often the instigator. They described her as someone who turned friends against Matthew, who spun stories to paint herself as the victim while plotting to make him disappear. The defense painted a different picture. Jennifer as a desperate wife, trapped in a volatile marriage with a man who had military training, a man who could be intimidating, a man she had tried to protect herself from. To them, the state was rushing to judgment, turning her into a monster without solid proof. But there was no denying the evidence that haunted the jury. The cleaned wall, the blood-stained carpet, the recordings, the absence of Matthew, a man who never would have abandoned his children. As the trial loomed closer, national media picked up the case. Headlines called it the Utah No Body Murder Trial. Reporters highlighted the bizarre mixture of romance and horror. A wife accused of murder, a lover turned informant, parents drawn into the conspiracy, and 3 children left orphaned in all but name. The public followed every detail, every motion filed, every new hearing date. People debated on social media whether Jennifer was guilty or framed, whether the lover was a hero or a snake, whether the state could win a conviction without ever finding Matthew's remains. And at the center of it all was Jennifer herself, sitting quietly in the Salt Lake County Jail, awaiting trial. She pleaded not guilty. She claimed innocence. Yet the words she had spoken to her lover still echoed in every headline, every news report. He's not a person. He wasn't mad. That's what makes this case unforgettable. It's not just the absence of a body. It's the presence of words that feel almost inhuman. Words that seem to strip away Matthew's identity, leaving only silence behind. The trial is set for December 2025. Until then, the questions hang heavy in the air. Where is Matthew Johnson's body? Will prosecutors convince a jury that Jennifer killed him, even without it? Or will Jennifer walk free, leaving Matthew's fate a mystery forever? For Matthew's friends, the soldiers who once served beside him, the answer is simple. They believe he was murdered, and they will never stop searching until he is found. As one soldier put it, "We've seen a lot in combat, but this is different. We don't leave a friend behind." And for his children, the hope is even more basic. Not for justice, not for verdicts, but for closure, for the truth about what happened to their dad on that September night. Until that day comes, the story of Jennifer Gledhill and Matthew Johnson remains one of the most chilling tales of betrayal, obsession, and silence in recent American true crime. A story that leaves us with a single haunting question: how well do we ever really know the person sleeping beside us?